Imagine standing on a muddy ridge in Eastern Europe, peering through your Zeiss binoculars, and realizing that for every single tank your army has left, the enemy has 11. That was the reality for the German Wehrmacht in June 1944. You are looking at a front line stretched over 400 miles, defended by a hollowed-out force with exactly 553 operational tanks and assault guns. Across the line of departure, waiting in the dense forests and swamps of Belarus, are 6,300 Soviet armored vehicles. This is not a battle. This is an industrial-scale execution. We are talking about Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, a campaign that would violently erase German Army Group Center from the map and inflict a defeat far more catastrophic than Stalingrad. If you want to understand the brutal mathematics of mechanized warfare and how empires are broken on the battlefield, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments which historical military blunder you want us to dissect next. We are diving deep into the tactical, logistical, and strategic nightmare that broke the back of the Third Reich. To understand the sheer scale of this impending disaster, we have to look at the global map in the early summer of 1944. For the American audience, June 1944 means one thing: D-Day. While American, British, and Canadian boys were fighting tooth and nail through the surf of Omaha Beach and the dense hedgerows of Normandy, a completely different beast was awakening in the East. The Normandy breakout was a monumental achievement. But in terms of sheer numbers and armoured density, the Eastern Front was where the vast majority of the German military machine was being ground into dust. The Soviets had been bleeding the Germans white for 3 years. Exactly 3 years, in fact. The launch date for Operation Bagration was intentionally set for June 22nd, the 3rd anniversary of Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. The irony was as thick as the sloped armour on a heavy tank. While the Western Allies were fighting to secure a beachhead, the Red Army was preparing to tear open a hole 250 miles wide in the centre of the German lines. But how did the Germans end up so hopelessly outnumbered in the centre of their line? It comes down to a colossal failure of military intelligence and the hubris of the German High Command. Adolf Hitler and his intelligence chief, Reinhard Gehlen, who ran the Foreign Army's East Department, were absolutely convinced that the next massive Soviet hammer blow would fall in the south. They looked at the strategic map and saw that Soviet forces had already pushed deep into Ukraine. A drive from Ukraine into the Balkans, or a sweeping hook toward the Baltic Sea, seemed like the logical next step to cut off German oil supplies and trap entire army groups. So, Hitler did what any armchair general with a map and a god complex would do. He stripped Army Group Center of its mobile reserves. He took the elite panzer divisions, the heavy Tiger tank battalions, and the motorized infantry, and shipped them south to Army Group North Ukraine. He left Army Group Center holding a massive bulging salient, a giant balcony sticking out into Soviet lines, defended mostly by exhausted leg infantry and horse-drawn artillery, It was a strategic overextension reminiscent of Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg, but stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Did the German High Command really believe the Soviets were out of reserves? Or were they just blinding themselves to reality? It was a bit of both, aided heavily by the greatest deception campaign in military history, known in Russian as Maskirovka. Just as the Allies fooled the Germans into thinking the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, using a fake ghost army commanded by George Patton, the Soviets pulled off an operational illusion on a continental scale. They moved hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and millions of tons of ammunition into the Belarusian forests under the cover of absolute darkness. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Fake tank concentrations were built in the south to feed German reconnaissance exactly what they wanted to see. Soviet fighter patrols aggressively swatted down any German Focke-Wulf reconnaissance plane that tried to peek over the assembly areas. The Germans were blind, deaf, and completely out of position. It was an intelligence failure, reminiscent of the American surprise at the Battle of the Bulge, but scaled up to a front line the size of the eastern seaboard of the United States. Let us break down the grim arithmetic of the defending force. German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, consisted of 4 armies: the 3rd Panzer Army in the north, the 4th Army in the center, the 9th Army to the south, and the 2nd Army, holding the far southern flank. On paper, Busch had about 800,000 men. But paper lies in wartime. These divisions were severely understrength, battered from years of continuous fighting, and desperately short of heavy weapons. Their anti-tank capabilities were woefully inadequate for what was coming. Out of those 553 armoured vehicles, a large portion were not even proper tanks. They were Sturmgeschütz III, or StuG III, assault guns. Now, the StuG III was a fantastic ambush weapon. It had a low profile, a lethal 75mm gun, and thick frontal armor. But it had no rotating turret. If a Soviet tank flanked a StuG, the German crew was dead. You cannot fight a highly mobile, deep penetration battle with turretless assault guns meant for infantry support. The few actual tanks they had, mostly Panzer IVs and a handful of Panthers, were spread so thin they were statistically irrelevant. Compounding this tactical nightmare was Hitler's brilliant strategic innovation known as Festplätze, or fortified places. Hitler ordered that key logistical hubs, cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, were to be designated as fortresses. The commanders were ordered to hold them to the last man, forbidding any tactical retreat. Think of the Alamo, but instead of a small mission in Texas, imagine ordering entire army corps to lock themselves inside cities while the enemy simply drives around them. In a war of maneuver, static defense is suicide. By ordering his troops to stand and die, Hitler was essentially building self-assembling prisoner of war camps for his own men. The German infantry, lacking trucks and half-tracks, would be unable to outrun the mechanized Soviet juggernaut once the line broke. They were tethered to these cities, waiting for a relief force that did not exist. Now, Look across the line at the Soviet steamroller. The Red Army deployed 4 massive fronts, which are equivalent to Western Army groups. The 1st Baltic Front and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian fronts. We are talking about a combat force of over 6 million men backed by another 700,000 support personnel. They brought 32,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars. But the real terror for the German infantry was the armour: 6,300 tanks and self-propelled guns. The industrial disparity was staggering. While the United States 8th Air Force was pounding the German factories in the Ruhr Valley into rubble, severely limiting German tank production, the Soviet factories, safely located beyond the Ural Mountains, were pumping out thousands of armoured vehicles every single month. The tip of this armoured spear was the newly upgraded T-34-85. Earlier in the war, the standard T-34 was a shock to the Germans, but by 1943, German long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns were tearing them apart. The Soviets adapted. They slapped a massive 3-man turret onto the chassis and mounted a high-velocity 85mm gun. This new T-34 weighed about 35 tons, had heavily sloped armour that bounced incoming rounds, and could reach speeds of 34 miles per hour on roads. Its wide tracks gave it an incredibly low ground pressure, allowing it to glide over the muddy, swampy terrain of Belarus, where narrower-tracked German panzers would sink to their bellies. Alongside them were the heavy IS-2 tanks, monsters armed with a 122mm gun that could rip the turret off a German Panther tank from a mile away. The sheer kinetic energy of a 122mm high-explosive shell could shatter armour, plating even without penetrating it. But firepower means absolutely nothing if you cannot move it and feed it. How do you sustain a drive of hundreds of miles into enemy territory? The answer came directly from Detroit. One of the most overlooked factors of Operation Bagration is American Lend-Lease. The United States shipped over 400,000 2.5-ton trucks to the Soviet Union, primarily the Studebaker US-6. The Studebaker was a rugged, 6-wheel drive beast that became the logistical backbone of the Red Army. While the German army was still relying on millions of horses to pull their artillery and supply carts, the Soviets were fully motorized. The Studebakers hauled the ammunition, towed the heavy guns, and carried the infantry right behind the advancing tanks. This American logistical muscle allowed Soviet commanders to execute deep battle doctrine, maintaining a relentless operational tempo that the horse-drawn German army simply could not escape. When a German unit retreated, they walked. When a Soviet unit pursued, they drove. The man orchestrating the main thrust of this operation was General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front. Rokossovsky was a tactical genius, a man who understood armoured warfare better than almost anyone in the Soviet High Command. His personal history is a testament to the brutal nature of the Soviet system. During Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, Rokossovsky was arrested, tortured, and had his fingernails pulled out and his teeth knocked out by the secret police. Yet, when the war broke out, and Stalin realized he had executed all his competent generals, he pulled Rokossovsky out of the Gulag and put him in charge of armies. By 1944, Rokossovsky was confident enough to openly argue with Stalin. During the planning of Bagration, Stalin wanted a single main breakthrough point. Rokossovsky insisted on two. He argued that the swampy terrain demanded a two-pronged attack to avoid a massive traffic jam. Stalin told him to go into the next room and think it over. Rokossovsky came back and held his ground. Stalin, recognizing the general's brilliance, relented. That singular decision to split the offensive into two massive armoured wedges would soon spell absolute doom for the German Ninth Army. The battlefield itself was a hostile entity. Belarus is dominated by the Pripyat marshes, a vast expanse of dense forests, winding rivers, and bottomless bogs. The Germans considered this terrain largely impassable for heavy armour. They fortified the hard roads and the high ground, assuming the Soviets would have to attack right into the teeth of their defences. But they underestimated Soviet combat engineering and the sheer willpower of the Red Army infantry. Soviet sappers spent weeks secretly building corduroy roads, laying thousands of felled trees across the swamps just beneath the waterline, so German reconnaissance could not see them. They were preparing to drive entire tank armies right through the swamps, hitting the Germans where they had absolutely no anti-tank defences. The summer heat was rising, turning the dirt roads into dust bowls and the swamps into humid, mosquito-infested nightmares. The temperature was pushing into the high 80s Fahrenheit, and the air was thick with tension. The trap was fully set. The German Army Group Centre was sitting in a massive salient, entirely blind to the apocalyptic amount of firepower massing just miles away in the dark forests. Field Marshal Busch was comfortably sipping coffee at his headquarters, trusting Hitler's intuition that the centre of the line was safe. But as the sun set on June 21, tens of thousands of Soviet partisans operating behind German lines began cutting telephone wires, blowing up rail lines, and destroying bridges in a coordinated wave of sabotage known as Operation Concert. The German logistical and communication nervous system was being systematically paralyzed from the inside out. And as midnight approached, thousands of Soviet artillerymen received the order to load their guns. The storm was about to break. At 0500 hours on June 22nd, the earth along a 400-mile front simply ceased to exist as a solid object. 32,000 Soviet artillery pieces, heavy mortars, and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously. The sheer kinetic energy unleashed in those opening hours dwarfed the preliminary bombardments of the First World War. To understand the physical devastation, we have to look at the primary instruments of this mechanized orchestra of death, starting with the BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher, universally known to the terrified German infantry as Stalin's organ. The Katyusha did not rely on pinpoint accuracy. It was an area denial weapon designed to completely saturate a grid square. A single BM-13 battery could launch over 132 mm rockets in a matter of seconds. Each rocket carried a nearly 50-pound high-explosive fragmentation warhead. Unlike a standard howitzer shell that buries itself in the dirt before detonating, muffling its own blast, the Katyusha rockets often detonated just above or right on the surface. This created a massive, overlapping shock wave that liquefied internal organs, ruptured eardrums, and instantly collapsed deep earthen dugouts. The sound of a Katyusha barrage was described as a deafening, tearing canvas noise that shattered the psychological resolve of even the most hardened combat veterans. How does a defending force hold the line when the very trenches they sit in are vaporized within the first 10 minutes of combat? They do not. The German forward observation posts, the telephone wire networks, and the frontline command bunkers were obliterated before the sun even fully crested the horizon. The Soviet artillery doctrine, refined through years of bloody trial and error, was now a perfectly calibrated science, known as the rolling barrage. The wall of high explosives crept forward at a precise rate, forcing the German defenders to keep their heads down in whatever craters they could find. And exactly 50 yards behind that wall of fire came the Soviet shock infantry, closely followed by the armor. As the artillery lifted, the skies darkened with the most produced military aircraft in human history, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. If the American P-47 Thunderbolt was a flying juggernaut, the Sturmovik was a flying tank. The pilot, the engine, and the fuel tanks were encased in an armored bathtub of steel ranging from a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch thick. This made the aircraft virtually immune to standard infantry machine gun fire and highly resistant to 20mm anti-aircraft rounds. But the true horror of the Sturmovik was its payload, specifically the PTAB anti-tank bomblets. These were 2.5-pound shaped charge munitions, roughly the size of a large hand grenade. A single Sturmovik could carry nearly 200 of them in its bomb bays. Flying just 100 feet off the deck, the Soviet pilots would open the bays and blanket a German armored column with hundreds of these miniature armor-piercing weapons. When a PAB struck the thin top armor of a Panzer IV or a StuG III assault gun, the shaped charge would easily burn through the steel, instantly igniting the ammunition and turning the vehicle into a 3,000-degree crematorium. The German flak 88mm guns, normally lethal against high-altitude bombers, were practically useless against these low-flying swarms that hugged the tree lines and popped up only to unleash devastation. The Soviet offensive struck like a trident, with 3 massive prongs aimed at the vital logistical hubs of the German Army Group Center. In the north, the 1st Baltic Front and the 3rd Belarusian Front executed a textbook pincer movement aimed squarely at the city of Vitebsk. This sector was defended by the German 3rd Panzer Army, commanded by General Georg Hans Reinhardt. Despite its name, the 3rd Panzer Army had almost no tanks left. It was a hollow shell composed mostly of infantry divisions stretched dangerously thin across the rolling hills and dense woodlands. Hitler had designated Vitebsk as a Festplatz, a fortified city meant to break the Soviet momentum. The German 53rd Army Corps was ordered to garrison the city and hold it to the last man. This was a tactical absurdity. By locking tens of thousands of his best troops inside a static urban environment, Hitler handed the operational initiative directly to the Soviets. It was a catastrophic blunder reminiscent of the French High Command, locking their elite paratroopers in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, allowing the enemy to dictate the terms of the siege from the surrounding high ground. The Soviet armored spearheads simply bypassed the heavy urban defenses of Vitebsk entirely. They punched through the weak infantry lines on the northern and southern flanks of the city, utilizing the superior mobility of their T-34-85 tanks. The T-34s, with their wide tracks and low ground pressure, easily navigated the muddy, forested terrain that the Germans had falsely deemed impassable. Within 48 hours, the two Soviet pincers met west of Vitebsk. The German 53rd Corps, comprising nearly 35,000 men, was completely encircled. General Reinhardt pleaded with the German High Command for permission to break out, while a narrow corridor still existed. The request was denied by Hitler until it was far too late. When the breakout attempt finally began, it was a disorganized slaughter. German infantrymen, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, were cut down by Soviet heavy machine guns and the brutal 76mm high explosive shells of the advancing T-34s. The entire 53rd Corps was annihilated, tearing a massive hole in the northern flank of Army Group Center. In the center of the line, the situation was equally grim for the German Fourth Army, tasked with defending the critical Moscow to Minsk highway near the city of Orsha. This was the most heavily fortified sector of the German line, defended by the elite 78th Sturm Division. The 78th was a heavily armed assault division, equipped with an unusually high number of StuG III assault guns, PaK-40 anti-tank guns, and dense minefields. The Soviet 11th Guards Army hit this sector head-on. The initial Soviet infantry assaults were repulsed with heavy casualties, as the German interlocking fields of fire and hardened concrete bunkers proved incredibly resilient. But the Soviets simply adapted and brought up the heavy sledgehammers. This sector saw the mass deployment of the IS-2 heavy tank. Weighing 46 tons and armed with a massive 122mm main gun, the IS-2 was a bunker buster. The kinetic energy of a 122mm high explosive shell was so immense that it did not even need to penetrate a German bunker to neutralize it. The sheer concussive force of the impact would spall the concrete on the inside, sending lethal shards of rock and steel flying through the enclosed space, killing the defenders instantly. Once the IS-2s cracked the outer defensive belts, the Soviet mechanized infantry poured through the gaps. The German 78th Sturm Division fought tenaciously, but they were being outflanked and outgunned. The heat was sweltering, with temperatures pushing into the high 80s Fahrenheit. The battlefield was a choking bowl of dust, cordite, and the sickly sweet smell of burning flesh and diesel fuel. German logistical lines, already strained, completely collapsed under the weight of Soviet partisan attacks. Operation Concert had been devastatingly effective. Supply trains carrying desperately needed artillery shells and medical supplies were derailed by partisan explosives miles behind the front. How do you coordinate a fighting retreat when your radio lines are slashed? Your messengers are dead, and your supply dumps are burning. The brutal reality is that, and control disintegrates, and an army degrades into isolated pockets of desperate men fighting for their own survival. This is exactly what happened to the German Ninth Army in the southern sector near the city of Bobruisk. Here, General Konstantin Rokossovsky orchestrated his tactical masterpiece. Facing the dense, seemingly impenetrable Pripet marshes, the German Ninth Army felt secure on their right flank. They believed no armoured force could cross the bottomless bogs. They were wrong. In the weeks leading up to the offensive, Soviet combat engineers, working in chest-deep muck and under the cover of darkness, had constructed miles of corduroy roads. They chopped down thousands of trees and laid them side by side, just beneath the surface of the swamp water. When Rokossovsky launched his attack, the German defenders were stunned to see entire brigades of 35-ton T-34 tanks driving straight out of the swamp. The Soviet 65th Army smashed through the stunned German infantry, while a second pincer attacked from the north. The German 9th Army, commanded by General Hans Jordan, was caught completely off guard. Jordan commanded a largely horse-drawn force. His artillery was towed by draft animals, and his infantry marched on foot. What happens to a horse-drawn army when it meets a fully motorized armored spearhead operating on American-built six-wheel drive Studebaker trucks? It gets outmaneuvered, outpaced, and systematically slaughtered. The Soviet mechanized brigades, rolling on Detroit rubber, simply drove around the retreating German columns. By June 27, the two prongs of Rokossovsky's attack met, trapping the entire German Ninth Army inside the Bobruisk pocket. Nearly 70,000 German soldiers were caught in a cauldron of fire. The scene at Bobruisk was a mechanized meat grinder, mirroring the horrific carnage of the Falaise pocket in Normandy, where Allied air and artillery pulverized trapped German columns, but on a much more concentrated and savage scale. The trapped Germans made suicidal breakout attempts, charging across open fields into the teeth of Soviet heavy machine guns and the devastating fire of the IS-2 tanks. The roads leading out of Bobruisk were choked with the charred wreckage of German vehicles, the bloated carcasses of thousands of artillery horses, and the bodies of fallen soldiers left to rot in the brutal summer sun. The front had not just been broken. It had been vaporized, leaving a yawning 250-mile-wide chasm in the German lines. And as the panicked reports of annihilated armies and missing generals finally reached Adolf Hitler's desk in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a terrifying realization set in. The impregnable Eastern Wall was not just cracked, it had completely evaporated. Adolf Hitler, staring at maps that no longer reflected reality, finally authorized the dismissal of Field Marshal Ernst Busch. In his place, Hitler summoned Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Führer's fireman. Model was a defensive specialist, a ruthless and energetic commander who had previously stabilized collapsing fronts by scraping together reserves and organizing localized counterattacks. But when Model arrived at the headquarters of Army Group Center, he found a situation that defied military science. He asked his staff where his reserves were, and the answer was a chilling silence. There were no reserves. There was no front line. There was only a 250-mile-wide void. And pouring through that void was the entire mechanized might of the Soviet Union, advancing at a terrifying rate of up to 15 miles a day. How do you plug a hole in a dam when you do not even have a bucket, and the water is already up to your neck? The brutal answer is that you cannot. And Model quickly realized that his only option was to try and salvage whatever shattered fragments of the army were still running westward. To understand the absolute helplessness of the German command in these critical weeks, we have to dissect the fundamental difference in military doctrine that had evolved by 1944. The Germans had shocked the world in 1939 and 1940 with the Blitzkrieg, a doctrine based on rapid tactical breakthroughs, close air support, and deep penetrations designed to cause the psychological collapse of the enemy leadership. But Blitzkrieg was a short war doctrine, designed for a nation that lacked the resources for a prolonged war of attrition. The Soviets, having absorbed the initial blows, had perfected something entirely different, a concept known as deep battle. Formulated in the 1930s by Soviet theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, deep battle did not just aim for a localized breakthrough to panic the enemy. It was a cold, mathematical doctrine of sequential, simultaneous operations designed to completely shatter the enemy's entire logistical and defensive depth. You do not just punch a hole in the line. You drive an entire tank army through that hole, bypass the strong points, sever the rail lines, overrun the supply depots, and keep driving until the enemy army starves to death in the field. This was not a battle of maneuver. It was an industrial-scale butchery, and the German army, stripped of its mobility and chained to Hitler's static fortress cities, was the perfect victim. We can see a haunting parallel to this shift in doctrine if we look back at the American Civil War. In the early years of the conflict, Confederate General Robert E. Lee achieved brilliant tactical victories through rapid maneuver and psychological shock, much like the early German Blitzkrieg. But in 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant took command and implemented the Overland Campaign. Grant understood that tactical brilliance meant nothing against overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority. He locked Lee into a relentless, grinding war of attrition, constantly flanking, constantly attacking, and never giving the Army of Northern Virginia a moment to breathe or rebuild. Grant used the massive logistical weight of the industrialized North to pin Lee against the defenses of Petersburg, eventually breaking the back of the Confederacy. Operation Bagration was the Soviet Union's overland campaign, executed with thousands of tanks and mechanized infantry, grinding the Wehrmacht into the Belarusian dirt through sheer attritional arithmetic. As the Soviet spearheads raced westward, the logistical demands of feeding this beast became staggering. A single Soviet tank army required thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations every single day to maintain its momentum. This is where the multidimensional aspect of the war truly reveals itself, because the unsung heroes of Bagration were not just the tank commanders, but the Soviet railway troops and the American merchant marine. As the Red Army advanced, they were moving over destroyed rail networks that the retreating Germans had systematically ripped apart, using specialized track-destroying plows. Furthermore, European rail gauges were narrower than the broad Russian gauge. Soviet engineering battalions worked around the clock, laying tens of thousands of miles of new track and converting the gauge right behind the advancing armor. But even the trains could only go so far. The final logistical link to the front line was provided by the massive fleet of American-built Studebaker trucks, hauling millions of cans of American Spam and hundreds of thousands of pairs of American-made combat boots. What good is a 60-ton German Tiger tank if it has no fuel, and its crew is starving and marching on rotting boots? The Soviet soldier who destroyed that Tiger tank was likely riding in an American truck, eating American rations, and communicating over American-supplied copper field telephone wire. The synergy of Soviet blood and American industry created a strategic juggernaut that the German war economy, currently being pulverized by the United States 8th Air Force, could not possibly match. The climax of this operational nightmare culminated around the Belarusian capital of Minsk in early July. The German Fourth Army, numbering over 100,000 men, had managed to survive the initial onslaught near Orsha and was desperately retreating westward toward Minsk. Their commander, General Kurt von Tippelskirch, realized the danger of encirclement and pleaded for permission to fall back rapidly. But the inflexible command structure in Berlin, paralyzed by Hitler's micromanagement, delayed the order. By the time the Fourth Army began a full-scale retreat, the Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army had already swept around their flanks. The terrain east of Minsk is dominated by the Berezina River, a name that strikes terror into the hearts of military historians. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée was nearly annihilated, while trying to cross the freezing waters of the Berezina during their catastrophic retreat from Moscow. Now, 132 years later, the German army faced their own Berezina disaster. The bridges had been destroyed by Soviet partisans or bombed by the Red Air Force. German combat engineers desperately tried to construct pontoon bridges under a relentless rain of high explosives. Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix strafed the riverbanks continuously, turning the crossing points into chaotic slaughterhouses. German vehicles were pushed into the river by their own panicked crews to create makeshift bridges of sunken steel. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped on the eastern bank, cut to pieces by Soviet artillery and hunted down in the dense forests by vengeful partisan brigades. By July 4th, Soviet tanks rolled into the smouldering ruins of Minsk, completely sealing the fate of the Fourth Army. Over 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Minsk pocket, and within a week they were systematically eliminated or forced to surrender. The collapse of Army Group Center was not just a military disaster. It sent a massive political shockwave straight into the heart of the Third Reich. For years, a faction of pragmatic German army officers had realized that Hitler's leadership was leading Germany toward total annihilation. The staggering, unprecedented losses of Operation Bagration were the final catalyst. They knew the Eastern Front had collapsed, and the Western Allies were simultaneously breaking out of Normandy. This realization directly triggered the events of July 20th, 1944, known as Operation Valkyrie. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a briefcase bomb in Hitler's briefing room at the Wolf's Lair, desperately hoping to decapitate the Nazi regime and negotiate a peace settlement before the Red Army reached German soil. The bomb detonated, but Hitler miraculously survived with minor injuries. The failure of the plot unleashed a wave of bloody paranoia. Hitler purged the Wehrmacht, executing thousands of officers, including some of his most brilliant tactical minds, like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was forced to commit suicide. The very institution that needed absolute flexibility and brilliant leadership to survive, the Soviet onslaught, was instead gutted and paralyzed by its own paranoid dictator. We must also analyze the catastrophic intelligence failure that allowed Bagration to happen, because it stems from a toxic blend of racial hubris and confirmation bias. Reinhard Gehlen, the head of German military intelligence in the East, was convinced the main Soviet blow would fall in the South. He was fed a steady diet of brilliant Soviet deception, the Maskirovka. But why did the Germans believe the fake intelligence so easily? It was because Nazi ideology viewed the Slavic people as subhuman and intellectually inferior. The German High Command fundamentally believed that the Red Army was a blunt instrument, capable of mass wave attacks, but entirely incapable of orchestrating a complex, continent-wide operational deception. They underestimated their enemy based on racial arrogance, and they paid for it with the lives of 500,000 men. This specific type of intelligence failure, born from underestimating an adversary's sophistication, has a striking parallel in American military history during the Vietnam War. Prior to the Tet Offensive in 1968, General William Westmoreland and the American Military Assistance Command believed that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were severely degraded and incapable of launching a massive, coordinated attack. They relied on body counts and flawed metrics, assuming the enemy was on the verge of collapse. When the Tet Offensive erupted simultaneously across dozens of cities and military bases in South Vietnam, it was a massive strategic shock. Despite overwhelming American firepower and technological superiority, the failure to understand the enemy's capability and intent led to a psychological and political turning point in the war. The German failure to anticipate Bagration was the exact same fatal arrogance, scaled up to an apocalyptic level. By mid-July, the magnitude of the Soviet victory was so immense that even the Western Allies, pushing through the hedgerows of France, had trouble believing the reports. Joseph Stalin, a master of political theatre, needed to prove to the world, and to his own people, that the back of the German Wehrmacht had been broken. He ordered Operation Grand Waltz. On July 17, 1944, exactly 3 years and a few weeks after the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union, the streets of Moscow were cleared. 57,000 German prisoners of war, captured during the encirclement of Army Group Center, were paraded through the Soviet capital. They were led by 19 captured German generals, still wearing their ruined, dust-covered uniforms. The prisoners marched in silence, broken only by the shuffling of their boots and the jeers of the Soviet civilians lining the streets. And in a final, brilliant stroke of psychological warfare, Stalin ordered dozens of street-sweeping machines to follow directly behind the marching columns, literally washing the dirt of the fascist invaders off the streets of Moscow. It was the ultimate humiliation, a visual confirmation that the master race had been beaten, broken, and marched into captivity by the very people they had sought to exterminate. The final butcher's bill for Operation Bagration defies modern comprehension. In the span of roughly 2 months, the German Wehrmacht suffered an estimated 400,000 to 500,000 casualties. 28 out of 34 divisions in Army Group Center were completely wiped off the order of battle. They lost over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, and an unimaginable 57,000 motor vehicles. It was the single greatest defeat in the history of the German military, far surpassing the disaster at Stalingrad in terms of men and material lost. The Red Army advanced nearly 400 miles, liberating Belarus, pushing into eastern Poland, and halting only when they outran their own massive supply lines on the banks of the Vistula River, just outside Warsaw. The Eastern Front had been permanently shattered, and the road to Berlin was now wide open. War is ultimately a cold equation of steel, blood, and logistics, and when a nation's hubris blinds it to the mathematics of its own destruction, the battlefield becomes an unforgiving executioner. We have dissected the strategic collapse, the tactical slaughter, and the logistical miracles of Operation Bagration. But now we want to hear your assessment of this monumental campaign. What do you believe was the single biggest factor that led to the total annihilation of German Army Group Center? A. The massive intelligence failure and Soviet deception tactics. B. Hitler's disastrous orders to hold static fortress cities. C. The overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority of the Soviet Union, backed by American Lend-Lease. Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the brutal realities of historical warfare.